Hello and welcome to the deep dive for another week. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to check out our website www.deepdiveau.net where you can sign up for our exclusive newsletter and surprises along with that. And also you can support us via our Patreon there as well. The link is via our website. Check out our socials, the Deep Dive AU on Instagram, TikTok and Facebook, and our YouTube channel where you can like and subscribe.
This is the Deep Dive Podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Steph Robertson is the founder and occupational therapist at SGR Occupational Therapy. As a multiply neurodivergent person herself, Steph is passionate about supporting others to embrace neurodiversity and live a life that aligns with who they are authentically. Steph has dedicated her career to providing trauma-informed and neurodivergent affirming treatment, education and advocacy through occupational therapy. She holds a master's degree in Advanced Occupational Therapy Practice and has extensive clinical research and lived experience, which are all drawn upon her therapy supports and trainings. Steph is known for her compassionate and holistic approach to therapy, focusing on empowering her clients to heal and thrive. She is committed to creating a safe and supportive environment where individuals can feel comfortable sharing their experiences and working towards their goals. Steph is skilled in providing unique and affirming approaches to therapy to ensure each and every person has their needs met and experience a felt sense of safety when it comes to receiving support. In addition to her clinical work, Steph is actively involved in educating and training other healthcare professionals on neurodiversity affirming practice and trauma-informed care. She is a strong advocate for raising awareness about the neurodiversity affirming movement and the importance of incorporating trauma-informed principles into all therapeutic practice. Steph's dedication to her clients and her commitment to providing high-quality compassionate care make her a respected leader in the field of neurodivergent affirming and trauma-informed occupational therapy. Steph loves all animals, even the creepy ones, being in nature, meditating, writing, reading, singing, and spending time with her family. And welcome, Steph, to the Deep Dive.
Thank you. It's very exciting to be here.
Yep, well, thank you very much, Steph. So, firstly, what is neurodivergent affirming occupational therapy?
So, I guess that's a pretty big question, really, because to be neurodivergent affirming means that we're moving away from any form of trying to change a neurodivergent person or make them behave in what we might see as a neurotypical or a neuronormative way. And so when it comes to occupational therapy, a lot of more traditional, I'd say, practices before we had the neurodiversity movement were based around I guess it really came down to teaching masking, like to our kiddos. And so to be neuroaffirming means that we're really focusing on what is meaningful for that individual, like what is meaningful and healthy and all those beautiful things to them as an individual. And then how do we facilitate their engagement in the things that they want to be able to do, that they need to be able to do, while allowing them to be them and working with their unique neurotype.
Okay, sounds fantastic. So how does neurodivergent affirming occupational therapy differ from traditional occupational therapy?
Look, I'll preface it with that good old quote, when we know better, we do better. And I think, initially a lot of us who've been working in this field for a long time thought that we were doing the right thing when we were trying to, for example, teach autistic children social skills, for example, thinking that we're wanting them to be able to engage with their peers in a way that society saw as normal. But now as we're moving into this neurodivergent affirming lens, it really is challenging practice, I think, for a lot of professionals and also a lot of parents who may have had an expectation of what therapy would look like for their child. So I would say the main difference is that there did seem to be a bit more of like a cookie cutter approach, like autistic child goes to therapy and gets a certain service or approach. Whereas now, my view anyway, is that every therapeutic experience or intervention needs to be 100% unique to the person. And we just have to get really creative.
Yeah, sounds really good. So what are the key principles of neurodivergent affirming care?
So what we're looking at, people often ask this about, what are we working on then? If we're not working on social skills or all these other things, what are we working on? And one of the key things for me in being affirming is identity, right? So we want to try to create a space, and I mean this for children and adults, where they can explore their own identity and have that be validated in their unique experience, whatever that looks like, right? So I like to start with that. And then another thing I think is really, really important to mention on this one is that sometimes if we have been, even for a short period of time, living as a neurodivergent person in a neuronormative world, we tend to have a sense of otherness or being different. And this can lead us to start not trusting our own interoceptive experience. So we start being like, I feel hungry, but when I said I was hungry, you said you can't possibly be hungry. So now I'm not listening. So interoception work, I think, is so incredibly important to allow people to actually feel their own body again. And then teaching skills around advocacy, self-advocacy, and also being able to communicate one's wants and needs across environments in whatever way that communication works for that person. So that might mean using alternatives and not just spoken language. And I also think one of the other key things that I've been leaning into a bit more on this idea about how do we be truly neurodivergent affirming, we have to recognize intersection of disability and other influencing factors. So, for example, a Black autistic person is not going to experience autism the same way as a white autistic person, the same way that if someone is queer or trans or any other divergence from neuronormativity, whether it's disability, neurology, gender, anything, they are going to have different influences of that. And I think when going into neurodivergent affirming care, we need to see that person as the expert of their own experiences, and we are then the guide,
Yeah. So what does your practice actually teach? Does it go to the adults or children, or be a little bit of both?
So for me, currently, I work in like a coaching model and consulting model. So I work with parents of neurodivergent children in supporting them to support their children, consulting with schools, other professionals, creating teams around children. But then I also work with adults. Currently, my adult population is majority late diagnosed women. Who are in the process of sort of unpacking what it means to explore that identity piece and really move into a way of living that feels aligned and comfortable rather than always feeling like we're going against the grain.
Okay, so what is the link between neurodivergent affirming care and trauma-informed care?
So to me, I believe they are like one and the same, as in we can't have one without the other. Because the foundation of trauma-informed practice is that we honour someone's nervous system experience and we understand that the way they may be responding to the world around them is coming from an intrinsic need to survive. So a behaviour we might see that someone might label as aggressive, it could be that individual is feeling that that's what they have to do in that moment to survive. It's a survival mechanism that could be based on a trauma experience. Now, if we sort of give the same lens to neurodivergent affirming care in that, if someone is behaving a certain way, responding a certain way, it can be anything in their life. Is that coming from a sense of what actually feels good or what doesn't feel good inside their body? It's that combination of honouring anyone's intrinsic experience and then supporting them with that. It's like meeting them there, saying, maybe I recognize that could be uncomfortable, or that's not how you want to be feeling, or whatever. And then we're going to co-create a solution out of it, with that person always maintaining a sense of autonomy over the experience. And I think that's a really sort of key overlap there.
So how can trauma impact a person's ability to participate in daily activities?
Yeah, so I find the best way to explain this is using the polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges. And it kind of just gives this idea that there are like 3 different pathways that we can respond from, like nervous system pathways at any given time. We have our fight or flight, which is our sympathetic nervous system that most people are familiar with. And then we have a dorsal vagal response, which is like freeze or fawn or shut down, where we just numb out the entire nervous system. And then we have like a ventral vagal, which is like the social engagement pathway is what he coined it, where we genuinely feel connected, we feel good, we feel sort of in that optimum learning kind of phase, right? What can happen when someone experiences a trauma? And again, trauma can be anything to the individual, because the trauma isn't the event. The trauma is how the body adapts post the event, right? So if someone's experienced trauma, what our nervous system can do is we have that thing of, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. And so if something triggers the nervous system to think there's any potential that they may experience that trauma again, or they need to survive, the body will flick itself into potentially the fight or flight pathway, which will mean the person becomes quite agitated. They may have anxiety. They may have, physical manifestations of that. Or they might go into a dorsal vagal response and completely shut down or experience dissociation and that sort of thing. So I think what's key to note here is that often, and not always, everyone's different, but someone who's experienced trauma is going to have a slightly altered neuroception or way they sense the environment to be more hypervigilant and hyper aware and more responsive. Perfect example is, sometimes someone will have their hair brushed and they're like, it really hurts. And you're like, it doesn't hurt to have your hair brushed. But it's that example of how when the nervous system decides to ramp up, it is perceived as pain or discomfort. And so I think what's really important here again is validating the experiences and also acknowledging that when someone expresses an experience, like my head hurts or whatever, that we accept that that is truth.
Mm-hmm. So what are some signs that you've observed in a patient that may have experienced trauma? Can you actually explain what you've observed in their sessions?
I think the most prevalent one, so my mind's going into two pathways. One is about what I've seen in adults and one is about more in children. One of the most prevalent ones is the presence of anxiety, and an anxiety that seems from an outside perspective to be like, I'm going to use the word irrational, but like fear presenting around things that perhaps another person may not be able to connect fear with. I often see there are physical things too that we know can be, again, nothing set in stone, but linked to trauma experiences, like a regression in certain skills. So for children, for example, they can regress in their toileting. They may become incontinent again. We may get sleep disturbances, nightmares, night terrors, difficulty with, sometimes we'll see that there'll be an aversion to a type of person, a thing, an environment, and that can be because that's triggering something internally. Basically, I often see in adults too who've experienced trauma that there is this real burnout experience that happens where, and again, as a generalization, but it's like the body gets to a point where it can no longer respond at that level of hypervigilance, and so it goes into a shutdown. And this is often when I find that adults not remember, but like even discover that they had experienced a trauma in their childhood, because our brains are so clever at blocking things out or dissociating memories and letting us survive in that way, right? But, eventually that becomes too hard. And so I think another really interesting thing, I was watching a video the other day and it was a brain scan and it was comparing a traumatized brain or someone who's experienced trauma to one that wasn't. And what they were noting from this is how much energy is being burnt by the traumatized nervous system, so much more so than the other in that hypervigilant state. So we often see fatigue, chronic fatigue, and burnout coming through later in life if we don't give that nervous system the support it needs earlier on.
Yeah, okay. So what are some common interventions that are used in occupational therapy for trauma-informed clients?
I wouldn't say there's like specific interventions per se, because I think I sort of tailor everything so specifically to the individual's goals that are meaningful. But I think the key thing for an occupational therapist to do is for us to check our own biases when we go into environments like that and we're thinking, this is a person's diagnosis presentation, this is what we're going to work on. But to them, something else might be way more important or more meaningful, and we may miss it due to our own like lens or like, you know, we all have biases. But yeah, so I think what's really important is to take a really individual approach to every person that we see, and also remember that the foundation of any form of participation is regulation. So if we want to help someone learn a new skill, or we want to help someone, you know, access the community more, that person must first be regulated in themselves. And so it's almost like that emotional state, sensory state, presence in the body, knowledge of the body, interoception, all that stuff has to kind of be our first step.
Mm-hmm. So, how can occupational therapy help people better manage their daily life?
So, I mean, the very nature of occupational therapy is that it's our job to help people better manage literally anything they do. Like anything that occupies your time is an occupation. And to really basically break it down, OT is broken into, you know, three kind of categories of self-care, leisure, and productivity. And these are different sort of umbrellas for different occupations. But we often see people have what we call occupational imbalance, where all of their energy might be going into their productivity and there's not enough being put into leisure and self-care, or, you know, vice versa. And so by looking at the intersection of the person, the environment around them, and the occupation that they want to be able to do or need to be able to do, then we go in and problem solve. So is it the person that could use some skills and training? Can the environment be modified so that this person can more easily access it? Is the occupation itself something that needs to be altered? Can we look at a different way of doing something? And then it's, I guess, finding what works for that person and experimenting.
So how can therapists create a safe and supportive environment for neurodivergent people or those who have experienced trauma?
So I guess it depends on, you know, the way in which you work. But if you have sort of, say, a traditional clinic setting, I think one of the most important things that we can do for creating safe environments is having options. So too often we go into a clinical environment and the lights are bright and there's this really clinical looking chair sitting in a corner and, you know, it's a bit sterile looking or whatever. And I think what's important is being able to create and give that person a say in what the environment will be like, offering accessible options, saying, do you prefer the lights to be turned down, offering different seating options, offering something like fidget tools or a blanket or a cup of tea, or, you know, giving options to the person that makes it feel like it's okay for them to express their needs in an environment. Because too often we, especially early on in our journey as like a neurodivergent person or someone recovering from trauma, we don't feel safe in actually being able to unmask and express our needs. Mm-hmm. So we need the environments to open those doors and make that available. And by simply asking questions and looking at different accessibility options, I think that's honestly the best way we can go. Another one is like a lot of places still use phone calls as their primary mode of communication. We know this is really, really hard for a lot of particularly autistic people, right? So what if there was the option of simply on the intake form, what's your preferred method of communication? And if they say email, that's how we do it from now on. And it's just giving people choice and autonomy and going slow. Relationships also so important. Without a solid relationship and a sense of felt safety for that person with you as a therapist, you're not going to get anywhere meaningfully. So if it takes a bit longer to create a connection where someone feels genuinely safe in your presence, then that's what we need to be going for first.
So what are the challenges that you've experienced with working with trauma survivors?
I think one of the biggest challenges that I've found, both from working with people but also from my own lived experience, is that there is still a lot of stigma around trauma, like depending on what the experience of the trauma was. And so I think while there's a cloud of shame around anything, and this also may apply to people who feel a sense of shame around diagnosis due to implications externally, whatever it might be. But when there is a sense of shame around one's own experience, it can be really hard to get close enough to the core issues to then be able to move our way through them and come up with solutions. And I think this is why I speak so openly about topics that for some are challenging, like, traumatic incidences and that sort of thing in my own work and on my podcast, because there's a beautiful quote, and I can't remember the name of the person who said it, and it frustrates me, but it was, shame dies when stories are told in safe places, or something like that. And so I think one of the biggest challenges has been people experiencing so much stigma throughout their lives around experiences, and like, we need to sweep this under the rug, and that induces shame and guilt, and then the person feels a sense of fault, and then we have to unpack that. So I think, in a really broad answer, what I'd love to see is a shift in societal response to trauma and difficult experiences that people have.
Okay, so how can occupational therapists collaborate with other healthcare professionals such as a GP, speech therapists and psychologists to be able to provide that comprehensive care for neurodivergent people?
Yeah, I love this question, and I think it's slowly starting to happen that we're getting more of this, interdisciplinary approach to supporting people. But the reason I think it's so important is because obviously, I don't have the key training that a speech pathologist does. I don't have the key training that a doctor has. But I do have a unique skill set that comes from being taught about how to analyze occupations and environments. And so I think when we bring in all of these really key components, breaking it down is a kind of a really basic, bland example, but I was talking about someone the other day about working with a psychologist and myself, and they're like, oh, the work you guys do is kind of similar. And I said, well, what if we look at it like the psychologist is working with you in your mind and your thinking, and I'm working with you in your nervous system, in your body, and then we're going to overlap them. And for this person, that clicked. She was like, yes, I get that. That makes so much sense to me. And so it was kind of like I was working from the bottom up in the body and the sensations, and the psychologist was working from the top up with the thinking, and we were bringing it all together. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think interdisciplinary support is so important.
Yeah. So what are some resources and tools available for people who want to learn more about neurodivergent affirming practice?
There's some pretty cool stuff out there. There's a great website called Autism Level Up, which is really beautiful and affirming. These are all just coming off the top of my head. I recommend We Are All Neurodiverse, which is a great book written by Sunny Jane Wise. They've put together that piece of writing in a way that I think is really palatable for people. Like it's sort of, you can understand what's going on, and that's great. There are so many books. I think what's really important, what I would say, another good one is Unmasking Autism by Devon Price. And I recently read a fantastic book, which is somewhere around here, Masking in Autism, which is more of a, what's the word I'm looking for, educational kind of text, but it's written by Kieran Rose and Amy Pearson, and it's great book about the history of autism specifically and masking and the implications. But I think what's great is that you could apply that same process of learning to a lot of different neurodivergent conditions. I would highly recommend following or reading content produced by neurodivergent people, because I think, we deserve to be at the forefront of the research that's being done on things that affect us as individuals. And I also think that the more we learn about lived experience, the more we're able to honour that sense of autonomy and validating human experience, which is, what I've been rambling on about this whole time.
Sounds really good. So final question, and this is the most important question. If you had 30 seconds to give some advice to a neurodivergent person, what would that be?
I would say that you are perfectly designed the way you were intended to be, and that the way your brain works is simply that it's a processing system. And that given the right environmental supports, the right, human to human supports, and connection with, communities that meet your needs, there is space for it to feel like you belong and that the world makes sense. And I think it's a case of us honoring that we need to find those spaces where we can thrive. And that there are so many people like myself who are loudly advocating for change so that people can feel more safe in the environment to truly be themselves. And I hope if you needed that message today, I hope it reached you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for being part of the podcast. You are wonderful. It's wonderful to see you as a neuroaffirming, affirming occupational therapist on the pod. So thank you so much for being a guest on the Deep Dive podcast.
It was such a pleasure. Thanks so much, Michael.
For more information on Stephanie, check out our show notes section at www.deepdiveau.net. We'll see you next time.